Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a nice lunch. We've got our last presentation of the day coming up, and lunch break. It was like the right time for lunch for me, but for some of you, it was just a weird mid-afternoon break. That was kind of what our lunch yesterday was. It was like the right time for the East Coast, but like really early for me. So that's just how it worked out. Um, Reminder, if you haven't registered yet for the conference and are planning on coming to our social event tonight or our Bugapalooza tomorrow, please register right now because I'm going to send out the link before the end of this presentation. And maybe Jason can drop the registration link in chat again so it's recent. And I'll check back in after the presentation, but now Ed Veal's going to do very, very basic jQuery.
Hello, welcome. I guess I'm going. I'm a substitute teacher today. As you know, George was originally scheduled to do this, so he and I worked some things out real quickly, and he sent me his notes from a presentation that he did a while back. And so I'm using his notes, and I'm going to make them mine. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to start sharing my screen, or sharing the screen that has his notes on it. Let me get that going. There we go. Can I move that out of the way a little bit? Yeah. All right. So what we're going to talk about is jQuery, but in very, very basic terms. Quick outline of how we're going to do this. I'm first going to talk about what jQuery is, how it can be used within Koha, and then we're going to run through some examples. So let's begin. First of all, why do we care about jQuery as it relates to Koha? Well, it's pretty simple in the fact that Koha's provided us 4 basic system preferences that we can use jQuery or JavaScripting to customize the particular pages. We can customize the OPAC, we can customize the staff site or client, and we can customize self-checkouts as well as the self-check-in system by using jQuery or JavaScripting. What those system preferences are, as you can see here on the screen, they each have their own system preference, and I'll let you all dive in at your own pace and look at those. Internet user is obviously for the staff client. OPAC user, obviously for the OPAC. Self-checkout user and self-check-in user. If you're looking for these in the administrative area, easiest way to find them is just use the search tool that's there and search for user.js. That will bring up those 4 system preferences, and then you can easily manipulate those as you need. So that's why we're interested in jQuery. We can use it to manipulate things on the screen, use it to automatically fill in fields, all sorts of interesting things. Some other questions that come up. Why jQuery? Well, or what is jQuery? jQuery is shorthand usage for JavaScripting. JavaScripting is a bit more complicated. As you can see here, JavaScripting, a particular line of JavaScript would include some JavaScript commands, some selector, and then some things that you're trying to do. jQuery, at its core, has created a library in the background. Koha has links out to these libraries, and the libraries allow you to use shorthand. So instead of having to use this whole bit here, you can simply start with the selector and basically what it is you want it to do. All right. That's the quick and dirty basics of what jQuery is doing and how it relates to JavaScripting. The high-end coders out there, there's a lot more differences, but that's what really jumps out for us in this setting. So your selector is basically defining what it is you want to affect, what it is the piece of what's being displayed on the screen, what it is you want to change, and then the next piece is what it is you want to do to it. For example, here we're hiding it. Basically, that means no display. All right. Next basic question is, let's start breaking down jQuery. jQuery, as everything does, you need to have a beginning and an end to it. jQuery always starts with the $sign. So any jQuery that you would write has your $sign, and it's got to end with a semicolon. All right, everything goes in between that. The next nested piece of information are going to be your parentheses with some kind of what is that? Single quote. And then anything that you would put within those single quotes. All right, and then then you have your a dot, which is going to differentiate to where you're going to now begin what it is you want to do. That's what's going to appear before the hide, the HTML, the function that you want it to do. When you put it all together, you get something like this with information in there. So now that we have the basic framework here, let's add some stuff to it. So how do we find, what is the selector? What's that first piece of it? And how are we going to find that? The selector is in the HTML, and you can use any of the HTML selectors you want. As you see here, you've got paragraphs, tables. These are all different selectors. You can even use CSS, classes, items, or IDs, things like that. Any HTML tag can have an attribute. And that's where you can link in all of the CSS pieces, such as IDs, classes, and other attributes. Moving along here, let's see what some of these event type functions are. So we can do things like .click, hover. These mean when you move the mouse over it, click on it, it's going to kick off. Hover, when you move the mouse over and hover, it's going to change the color of it. It's going to do whatever it is you want it to do. Toggle, it's back and forth. You can do resizes, fading, different effects, fade things, hide things. This is by no means an exhaustive list of things you can do. There are dozens of other things that you can do. But the basic answer to all that is we want to find something, and then we want to make it do something else. And that's what we're going to dive into. If you're using Chrome or Firefox, there are some easy ways to look at the code. Here on George's notes, he's got Control-Shift-I. That works great in Windows. Doesn't work as well on a Mac. For those of us that use Mac, on a Mac, it's Option-Command-I. But I didn't write these notes. Then that will allow you to look at the inspector and actually see the HTML. Let me jump over to a page, and let's do that real quick. Actually, I'm going to do it on this page specifically. So when I open up the inspector, that's what shows me all of the different HTML. And from here, I can find classes, all of these different features that I'm going to need to create that jQuery. Move that down a bit. There we go. All right, so that's an easy way to get to that information. Let's talk about some of the system preferences that we mentioned early on. There's a lot of documentation on the Koha Wiki about using jQuery. It's a great link out here. There's a lot of good information there. There are two basic schools of thought on how to add jQuery to these system preferences. The first school of thought says that you add this particular piece of code at the beginning of that system preference. And then you have this particular piece at the very end, and all of your jQuery, everything that we've talked about up to this point. And I'm gonna look through some examples, and we're gonna play with this a little bit when I'm done going over this, is all nested within that. So you have all of your jQuery in there. That's one school of thought. The other is that for each piece of jQuery that you use, you put it inside that. So one says you do all of your jQuery within this, and the other says each piece gets its own document ready statement. Both do work. As George's notes state, he says he prefers the first method. Generally, I agree with him. However, if you're using the first method, you need to be careful. If you start nesting document ready statements, it gets messy. So you have to be consistent with whichever method you're using. Whichever method, stick with it and be consistent with it. You can also cause some issues with other other functions nested within there. So you have to kind of be careful. All right, let's look at some basic simple jQuery and how we can use it. These are some of George's examples. I'm just going to go through some of them piecemeal, and I'm probably not going to do all of them. We'll just look at the ones that seem to make sense and go on from there. So this first one, let's say, for example, on the staff catalog, you wanted to make the my account link go away as an option. You could make that link go away for your staff. Okay, so the way we would do that is this particular piece of jQuery here, but let's dissect it. Opens up right here, and then we have our selector here. So the question is, how was this selector chosen? Let's go back to the client. Let's go into our inspection here and take a look. That a little bit bigger. All right, so we see here, looking at that, I like to, instead of using the key command shortcuts, I like to right click on whatever it is I want to dive in and see if I can find a way to use some jQuery. I'll right click and use inspect, because it is going to, at least within Chrome and Firefox, highlight that particular piece of code. So I can easily move through it. And if you'll also notice in the upper right, as I move my mouse through the code here, it highlights on the actual web page what it is I'm looking at. So I find that very useful in dissecting what it is I need to use. So I'll come in here. We see a class here, top links my account. That seems to be a good one to use. We notice that these other ones have, they're not affecting what it is we want to affect, so we're not going to use them. We've got some others up here. Let's go ahead and look at these, top link, different options in there. So that's how the selector's chosen. That's how this was chosen. Okay, and then we decide what we want to do with it. We want to hide it. We could do other things with it. We could add CSS to it. We could, to change its coloring, to change its styling. There are lots of different things we could do. For this example, we're just going to hide it. So I'm going to cheat and just copy and paste this. And I'm going to come over to my system preferences. I'm going to search for user.js, and we'll see that brings up the 4 system preferences that we were talking about: the self-checkout, the self-check-in, OPAC, and the staff client. or the intranet. Because we're talking about the intranet up here, we're going to use the intranet system preference. Open this up. I have already added this. It will not be there for you. I went ahead and did that to make this go a little faster. And then I paste the jQuery in that we want. One of my recommendations is when you put some jQuery in, add a comment. Added to stop staff from easily getting their own account. Why you would want to do this, I don't know, but it's a good example. So we've added a comment. This way, if anybody else is looking at your code, they can easily understand what it is you're trying to do from there. Then we go ahead and hit save. Now if I refresh this page, when I come up here, it's gone. So we've simply hidden that. First example there. Let's go ahead and look at some of these others. Some of these others are the same process, but they're going to be for different things. Hide my checkouts. This one I actually think can be useful for a lot of multi-library settings. There is a downside to it. If you do it, it's very difficult to change libraries. So if you want to prevent your staff from changing the library settings, in other words, coming up in here and saying, I want to change my library to a different library, you can. Okay. So these are some basic jQuery statements for hiding some of these things. Let's look at this. This one adds some extra content here. Let's talk about that. The first two were simply using a selector and hiding it. This one gets a little more complicated because it's not only looking at the selector, it's using what we call a contains. What that's doing is that's looking within that code for a specific piece of information. So let's go over there. Let's come back up here. Let's look at the inspect. And as we see, there's nothing that differentiates this from the other top links. It just is a top link. So if we simply use top link, it's going to have effects on other things as well, like it would remove the search history. So we don't want to hide based on that. We want to hide based on something a little deeper in. So we're going to choose to hide on set library or search history, depending on what it is you're trying to do. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy this one. Let's use this one. Come in here, come back here. Let's go to my system preferences. Oh, there they are. They're still up here. Open up this one. And I'm going to add this one in here. Wow. Hides the set library option. All right, so when we save this and refresh, now the set library option is gone. So those are some basic, simple ways to do basic customizations within here. There are a lot of other things we can do. That's just looking at hiding. George went into some additional examples here where we are looking at subtype. This is one that I have used a lot, hiding the subtypes, not so much on the staff side of things. Traditionally on the OPAC, there were some additional subtypes searching in the advanced search that caused patron confusion. So you might want to hide some of those. You would do a very similar thing within the OPAC to hide those. What do we have here? Main. Okay, yeah, this is makes a particular branch disappear on the login page. So if what this example does is, if I log out, when I go to log in, you can control what branches appear. Logged back in here. Okay, so that's one of those features that you might want to look at. There are a number here. Make the branch drop down, label different than on the login page, so you can do different things like that. Most of these pertain to multi-branch libraries or a couple of other things. First piece of jQuery George learned. This is actually probably the first one I learned as well. On the OPAC, come on. I want that to go away at the top of the screen. Just bring that down a bit. There we go. When we go to the OPAC, there are I need multiple monitors. Sorry, I'm using a laptop. On the OPAC, the login, if somebody's registering, actually that wasn't even for self. Let's just go ahead and look at it here on the staff side. I think this is a better example. On a patron record, the details here, when you go to edit somebody, it says surname. This is both on the OPAC and on the staff client and can generate some confusion. Say you wanted to say last name instead of surname. It's pretty simple. This is what we're doing. We're changing the label. It's going for slightly deeper into this. The label for this particular field we want to change. So let's look at that. Let's come in here. Let's look at the actual code. What we have here is it clearly says label for surname. So now we have to figure out how to translate that into jQuery. What we're doing is, because it's a label, this is a pretty standard format. You do label and then you use the square brackets for equal sign and then the field that label is for. So then you go ahead and change that. See, it says label for surname, and then that's where it's going to change that. So let's change that one. Let's come in here. I'm going to open this up in a different tab. Let's come here. User.js, intranet. Here, let's add this. That's not the right thing. I guess I forgot to copy and paste it, didn't I? Okay, so we grab this, come into the right tab, and paste it in. I am doing some indenting here just because I find it easier to read. Changes surname to last name. Got the label, what it's changing and what it's changing to. Let's save that. Let's take a quick look back over here, do a refresh, and we now have last name. So this is a really basic way of making basic changes to things. You can do a whole lot more than this. This is the very intro. What do we have here? He's changing first and middle. That's something that commonly comes up. Nickname instead of other names. You can change any of those fields. Another thing you can do is create some is to create autofill, data already in these different fields. This is if we wanted to have the patron entry already have a value in it of 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. Both password fields set to a particular thing by default. Let's see, what else does he have here? As it says here, you can do a lot more here. You can. This is a bit more complex one. Let's look at this. Here he's changing the entry form surname, and he's using blur. What this is doing is let's go ahead and look at this. By using blur here, entry form password 2, he's moving that same data from password from one field to another. Let's go ahead and make this change. Let's add this in here. I'm just going to paste it in here and save it. I'll add that comment later. Now when we refresh this, let's see what happens. If we put in our password, you'll notice what this is doing. It's hard to see on this because it has it hidden. It didn't keep that one. I'm not sure exactly what he had that built to do. Let's reread this. Blur function entry. Password 2, value, entry form. Okay, so what he's doing is he's pulling that. There you go. I missed the very end of it here. He is setting both password and password 2, both fields, to be the surname. So what that's doing is when the surname is added in here, let's go ahead and add in the surname. Let's add in a different surname. Last, when we tab to another field, what that's going to have done is it is going to, using blur, it's going to have filled these with that surname. We can't, with that same field, we can't see it simply because it it's hidden in here, but it allows it to pull whatever's in here and populate it into these two fields. Handy little jQuery trick there. Let's see here. What else does he have? Cataloging results, search form. Okay. Yeah, I'm just kind of quickly going through his notes. I'm going to jump down here rather than look at each one of these. And I'm going to talk about some other resources that we have available to us. The Koha community has a jQuery library. This library is invaluable if you're doing any basic jQuery. It's a great place to begin. You can do all sorts of stuff. It's divided up rather nicely. A nice table of contents. You've got the intranet, all of the different jQuery that's submitted by the community in here. And then you've got the OPAC jQuery. There's a lot there as well. It's also broken down into things like search, fields, enhancement, enhanced content, adding some different enhanced content information. Each one of these is literally a piece of code. Let's go ahead and grab one here. Let's see, what is a fun one to look at? Hide my home link in Bootstrap. Here we go. This is one that was written a long time ago and still holds true. Has a little bit of different coding in here. Actually, that's not a good one to look at for a basic course. Let's look at this other one. Let's relabel something here. Here's a great example of relabeling. So from here we have, let me make that a little bit bigger. Here in this relabeling example, we're using the more searches and we're specifically one that contains the terms course reserve. And they're changing it to have a capital R instead of lowercase. But what's important here is the way it's structured. It's using .html, and it's going to create this piece here. You can also use .text. I think the other one had .text, but that's not sure which one I was looking at. There we go. We've got this search here, does this, and it's changing this text to show this text like this. Pretty straightforward. Let's look at some of these others. These are some. One thing to note, each one of these examples gives who wrote it, what it's supposed to do, and as well as what it's intended for, as well as the version. The version can be very important. There are some of these that are now going to be obsolete. And here's an example of something. It was good for 3.18, but as Koha's advanced, it needs to be modified for other versions. Okay, so you need to be careful when there's a little bit of advanced jQuery. So you see, you can do a whole lot with jQuery. This is a great place to look for some of the basic structure things that you would use making basic changes. Some other resources that George mentioned up here that I did not mention, but I want to go into, is 3W Schools has a really good page on basic jQuery. It talks a lot about the structure of it, how it's built. If you've not used this website, I recommend it highly. It's a great resource for learning how to do some of these things. All right. I've pretty much been through what he's done here. I can continue to go over and show more examples and dive into it, but I'd kind of like to open it up for some questions and see where we go from here. Do we have any questions yet?
We do not have any questions yet. Hannah did say, I managed to accidentally hit whatever the code is in Firefox at least a couple times a week while using advanced cataloging, whatever the shortcut is. I'm like, I'll do that sometimes too, just, be typing around and it's like, oh, I must have pressed like Alt-I think is the inspect in Chrome on Windows. And
yeah,
sometimes I'll just be like, oh.
Yeah, since I don't use Windows much, I'm not sure what it was. It's in here somewhere. He documented it.
Yeah. Michael asked, remind me what the Apple shortcut is for displaying the inspector?
It is Option-Command-I in Chrome, and I think that works in Firefox as well. But you'd have to Google it.
Okay.
The reason I don't use the key command as much is, as I was showing, I like to go in and actually right-click on what it is I'm trying to adjust, and then open up the inspector, simply because it takes me right to that. If I'm not doing that and I just simply use the inspector here, using that key command, it just takes me up to the top, and then I have to find through all the nested HTML what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I also usually do the inspect element because it'll usually take me right to the place. Sometimes I don't know.
It gets you close. It gets you close.
Sometimes I'm surprised that it doesn't work quite right because I'll be like inspecting directly on the element that I need and it'll take me like to its parent div instead or something. And yeah.
Yeah, I've discovered, I think it has something to do with sometimes how they're nested.
Yeah. And I think especially with stuff where there's options to hide it in Koha, like there's system preferences where you can hide it, I think it's usually those times that it takes me to the parent. Yep. And it's probably, like you said, something about the way that it's nested to make those preferences work. Yep. Let's see.
This was very, very basic. as you saw, looking at, and if anybody's really interested in diving into the jQuery, I do recommend spending some time with the 3W School site, because it'll give you what way more than you need to know for Koha, but you'll get a good understanding of it, and then you can really grow into doing some of the much more advanced stuff that we see in the jQuery library, because you can
Yeah.
do some really wild stuff.
Oh yeah. Jennifer Weston asks, can individuals submit additional examples to the Koha jQuery library? Yes. You just need to get a wiki account, which we talked about a little bit earlier today. I think maybe Jason can post the link in the chat again. And let's see. Michael asks, do you have any tips for troubleshooting jQuery? I know that's probably more advanced, but there's some jQuery on my system that doesn't seem to be working properly, and I'm trying to figure out why.
Yeah, it is a bit more advanced. Depending on how complex the jQuery is you're talking about. One of the tricks that I learned real early on, and I think the jQuery library has this as an example up at the top of it. Under templates, nope, it doesn't have it here any longer. There used to be a link, and I'm sure I could dig around in here and find it. But there's a really good example. Let me see if I can find it. What I'm looking for is to add this CSS. And what I have done in the past is go in and Lisette, maybe you can find that. Do you know what I'm talking about, where you add the CSS to add some color and a text box, I mean, and a frame around what it is you're trying to affect? That can really help you narrow down the selector. And that's usually where your problem is. Usually.
That sounds great. I hadn't heard. I don't know about that.
You haven't seen that little piece of jQuery? I think Liz wrote it years ago. Let me see if I can. It'll take me some time to find it, but basically what you're doing is you're adding, I'm using one of these examples, instead of hide, let's find one that changes something.
I can talk a little bit about what I do when I'm troubleshooting jQuery, at least some of the more basic steps.
Okay. Yeah, if you'll talk about that while I try to find this real quickly.
So I often the first thing I'll do is, especially if something broke either right when I put it in or when I edited it, is I'll use the JS Fiddle tool to just plug in my whole jQuery, so that if when I edited it, I accidentally left out a semicolon that broke everything, it tells me really fast and easy. And so like JS Fiddle, I use that anytime I'm editing jQuery at all. That's what I'll do. And then the other thing is, especially if it breaks after an update, it might be worth looking at the code to see if it's doing something like counting the number of columns, if it's like trying to do something in a certain column on a box, because the number of columns might have changed. And so then you might have to have it be, column 5 instead of column 4, something like that. And sometimes what I'll do also when I'm working on jQuery is just take out a, set up a sandbox, or soon we'll have a test server, so go on the test server and just put in only that piece of jQuery to make sure that that works. Because a lot of my problems come up with it when I'm like editing things. And then, yeah, like selecting making sure you're using the right kind of selector. Like if it's a div or a span, you have to like tell it differently what you're selecting, like hashtag or a dot. And so making sure to check those, and especially after updates, if you're starting to have problems, there's been a couple times where we used jQuery that was like selecting on a span ID, but something had been changed, so it was a div instead now.
Yeah, I'm not finding this off the top of my head.
That seems like it would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll find it and add it. We can get it added to the notes afterwards. Another thing that I've discovered is frequently when I find an error in my jQuery, it's because I've not closed I'm missing a single quote, or I have double quotes and single quotes not nested. So you see here, like on this one, you've got a single quote and then you have double quotes within it. If these were put in as single quotes, it would not work. And I find that a lot of the time that's a mistake that I have. Or I've left off the last semicolon at the end of a line. That's another thing I frequently will catch. But it depends on what problem you're trying to diagnose. If it's just not working,
Yeah.
or if it's broken something else.
And yeah, that's why when it's not working, what I usually do is, plug it into JS Fiddle or a similar tool that can read the syntax and tell you if there's lots of things it can't tell you because like Koha has specific divs and stuff. It won't be able to tell you like you called that the wrong thing, but it can tell you when you've, forgotten a semicolon or left out a quote mark. So then everything after that's all messed up. So, okay. Any other jQuery, very, very basic jQuery questions?
I may have found it.
Ooh.
Okay, let me go into here. So here, I'm just gonna. Basically, this is the framework I'll use. Whatever the selector is I'm looking for, I'll put right there. And then I will have this after it. And what that does is it's going to add this custom CSS to the selector area that I'm trying to modify. So what it does is it gives it a border, and it makes that border 2 pixels in a red border. So it helps me identify, okay, yes, that is the right selector that I'm trying to use. Or no, it's not. When I'm at the very beginning, that's one of the first things I'll do to make sure I'm actually affecting the correct selector. Sometimes we talked about this top, these top links, and the fact that this one right here, no, it was this one needed to use a contains because top links was too generic. If I had used top links, let's put top links in here. Let's do this. Dot top links. That looks right. Got that. Now when I come back into, what was that for? That was for, well, yeah, it didn't highlight all of them. But that it would allow me to see the top links and highlight them. And let me do something different on the screen here. Let's let's inspect this. Not this class row. I'm trying to find something. Breadcrumbs. Let's use breadcrumbs as an example. Copy breadcrumbs. Refresh it. Too many things on this tiny little screen. Yeah, that didn't work. But it may be a quotation problem. Let me change these. Oh, breadcrumbs is also not a class. It's a ID. I think. Anybody remember?
Not off the top of my head. I haven't done much.
Yeah,
with
it's an ID.
breadcrumbs.
Had to identify it as an ID instead of a class. So that's how you set the selector. Do that. I'm going to leave all that. Now let's refresh. There you go. So it pulled that whole breadcrumb div or anything with that ID and identified that. So if I only wanted to change a piece of it, then I would know, wait a minute, I need to change something, I need to change something else. I like to do that when I'm testing and beginning to build it. All right. What other fun questions?
Let's see. Michael just said, very helpful. Thank you. Very helpful. It makes me feel a bit more confident about trying my hand at it. Thank you, Ed and George. Jason posted 20.05 adds linting to the code mirror system preferences. So that should also put an icon in the gutter if you've got a typo missing punctuation.
Yeah.
That'll be, I forgot that that was coming in 2005. I knew it was coming eventually, but it can be hard to keep track of like what's coming in 2005 versus like 2011 because I follow the bugs. So
I loved getting the line numbers. That was a great addition. Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay. Well, I'll keep the chat open if anyone else has any more questions for Ed. I wanted to thank everyone for coming